Hello and good day, everybody who's listening in, despite of or irrespective of time zone. And it's my great privilege and pleasure to be here at the X-Road Community Days to talk about a bit about what we in Nortal have been doing for the last half a year or so, which is using X-Road as a backbone for GovStack Information Mediator. So those not familiar with Nortal, we are an Estonian company founded in Estonia with a head office in Estonia, founded in about year 2000, and by now we have 25 offices around the world and over 2,000 talented employees tackling large-scale projects for governments and different industries. And my name, as Annette said, is Allan, and I'm currently an architect and team lead at Nortal, been there for over 3 years, and I had the privilege to work with some of the top talent in Nortal in creating a crucial building block solution for GovStack. But what is GovStack? I think a little introduction is necessary here. So in essence, GovStack is an open source community, not very dissimilar to X-Road, but it's an open source community that tries to solve the problem that many governments have with digitalization, that the services they're trying to digitalize don't differ that much, and the same solutions created over and over and over again. And GovStack tries to unify it, to provide a standard or a standard way of doing it. And it does it by employing things called building blocks. Those familiar with the DOGOF framework, the building block here we're talking about is very similar to architecture building block, so ABB. But a building block, in essence, is a reusable component. And an architecture building block is a reusable set of specifications, requirements, cross-cutting requirements that can be employed with no or minimal modification. And a building block is something against which one can validate existing solutions or create a new custom solution. So GovStack in itself doesn't develop software. It develops the specification based on which software can be developed. Information Mediator is one of those building blocks. And what Information Mediator does is, again, not dissimilar to X-Road. So if we envision the base layer, the physical infrastructure of a network, and different governmental or public sector or private sector organization with their services, the Information Mediator is between those two layers. So it facilitates that, it facilitates the communication between different services using the physical network underneath. So it is an interoperability and communication layer. And we were tasked with creating a sample solution building block based on the architecture building block that GovStack has developed for Information Mediator. So what are the key issues that the Information Mediator tries to solve? So that's an arbitrary distinction. So basically, we have the security and usability. Information Mediator itself doesn't provide any services, but it has to ensure that all the services using it to communicate have the data integrity, confidentiality, and availability. All the services are logged and monitored. The service access is handled. On the usability side, there is directory of services, you have service discovery, there is scaling and throughput, and Information Mediator, the architecture building block, defines that there should be a way to communicate asynchronously, and they have selected PubSub model to do that. If we compare that to what X-Road offers, you can see that many of those problems are solved by X-Road as is. Data integrity, logging, monitoring, scaling, directory services, service access to a point, I will come back to it later, are all solved. So it made very much sense to use X-Road as the underlying technology. But again, as GovStack tries to envision the architecture building blocks, X-Road is just one way to solve this problem. But since we are the first to develop a solution building block based on the architecture, we picked X-Road, and we can talk about X-Road as the backbone of the information mediator, the solution we built. So if you look at this graph, those familiar with how X-Road works, for them it shouldn't be nothing new, really. So you have those silos. You have those silos and those organizations connecting to their security servers, each having their own security server. You have a central server, and you have communication going through it. It's the same concept in information mediator, is that behind those silos, in those silos, there are building blocks. And each building block communicates with each other and with other silos using the X-Road. But the X-Road here is the underlying technology. It's something on top of the physical network, and we had to amend it a bit. We had to add to X-Road. So what did we need to add? The core thing we needed to add was the asynchronous part. Those familiar with X-Road code will know that X-Road itself, basically, theoretically, security servers would allow for asynchronous communication. But currently, it's implemented in a synchronous way. So we needed to add this asynchronous component to X-Road. And it's a very modern feature that's very common. But we didn't want to fork X-Road. That would have been against the idea of using X-Road as the core technology. And as with every fork, we would have to maintain that fork. The fork would start living a life of its own. And since it's just a solution building block to an architecture building block, it's not the thing in itself. Like, anyone can come along and try to propose a new version of an information mediator. We didn't want to create another X-Road or UXP or anything in that sense. So we didn't want to fork. We wanted to use X-Road as is. So we opted in adding the pub sub layer as a subsystem. Now, Petteri Kivimägi has written a couple of very good blog posts and even a white paper on adding pub sub to X-Road, and I highly recommend anyone interested in it to go and read that as well. But I consider pub sub to be the next kind of iteration of X-Road. So first we had the SOAP communication, then the REST endpoints, and essentially pub sub should be the next logical evolution. But, and I know that NICE has also created a proof of concept in that, and they used the pub sub system as an add-on to the security server. But for now, X-Road core project doesn't allow for that functionality. We needed to add it. We add it as a subsystem. But then we ran into a bit of a problem with the subsystem. So we needed more access control that X-Road currently allows. X-Road allows you to configure the security server and the subsystem access quite well. You can specify who can access which subsystem, which other security server can connect to yours, and call services in your domain. But we needed something to control the access within the domain. Who can access which room? Who can create events? Who can publish what? Who can subscribe to what? And this is something that was hard to do, or would have been too complex to do within the X-Road code without like forking it, and we didn't want to fork it. And on the same note, we tried to avoid duplicating management roles. So what does it mean? An X-Road service administrator or an X-Road system administrator should be able to administer the rooms within the environment. Because again, bear in mind, from GovStack perspective, the X-Road, the security server, and the pub subsystem are considered one and the same. This is just the information mediator building block. So it didn't make sense for an administrator to create one administrative account in one system within that thing, and then create another account in another system and kind of hop between them, we needed to share those roles. We needed to share the system administrator, the service manager, the service administrator. So we ended up forking after all. For now, the only modification we did to the core X-Road is we allowed for OAuth 2 instead of PAM. So X-Road relies on the Linux's pluggable authentication module to store its user accounts and configurations, the user access roles. We needed an option to do it outside from the security server so that our system, the PubSub subsystem, could access the same roles. We tried to get PAM linked to outside of the security server, but that quickly became unfeasible and we didn't feel that would be a reasonable choice. So what we ended up with is just a configuration parameter. So it's the core X-Road, it's the security server, but within configuration, you can say, let's not use PAM, let's use something else. Let's use something that is OAuth 2 compatible. We just deployed a key cloak server and added all the necessary, it's about 6 roles and users that X-Road security server needs into the key cloak. And now we have the seamless management experience. So the same system administrator, the same service manager who's managing the security server and managing the PubSub system can create the rooms, can specify who can access what within our subsystem. So without going too technical, I'm going to give you a quick high-level overview of how the X-Road and our PubSub subsystem work together. Coming from top to bottom, PubSub needs rooms, queues, topics, what have you. We opted for ActiveMQ Artemis, not to be confused with ActiveMQ, which is very old. ActiveMQ Artemis is quite new. And again, we don't want to rely too much on the technology itself for the building block. As with X-Road, we didn't want to rely on ActiveMQ Artemis's built-in user management, access control management, because in essence, that would go against the point of creating a reusable and modifiable solution building block. With this solution, you could easily switch out Artemis for something else. You could use Kafka there, RabbitMQ with, like, there will be some change, but I would say with minimal changes. And some may ask, why didn't we put a kind of central component? Why we didn't try to add the message queuing system to the central server, for example? Well, there are many reasons, but the major reason is that with public sector entities, who would provide the service level agreement for that? Who would provide the funds for that? Who would own the data? There are so many problems that public sector wouldn't use a central place to store the data. So everything we did needed to be behind a security server so that it would be within the domain of the owner. So we have this ActiveMQ Artemis, and we have a messaging API. The messaging API's sole purpose is to relay the communication between Artemis and X-Road, the security server, by applying the predefined access control. Who can do what? That access control is stored in a database, and there is a management API which shares that database to modify that access control. The management API can be accessed in two ways, over X-Road, over the subsystem, and by an internal UI. This UI service is just one instance of the information mediator. There is no shared UI between building blocks or between instances of the information mediator building block, because again, this is a building block. This is something that gets deployed in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 20 ministries, each having their own. We're using a proxy here, and the proxy's only purpose is to tie the PubSub management API and PubSub messaging API together, so they would look as a single subsystem from within the X-Road network. And from there on, we are sending requests and responses through the X-Road network. And while within the GovStack ecosystem, it's intended that each side has their PubSub subsystem, this solution is fully compatible with native X-Road as well. In essence, if you have an information system that doesn't employ GovStack's PubSub model, and you get registered within the relevant security server, you get your access there registered, and you compile a message that's compatible with the GovStack API, everything will work. You will be able to subscribe, you will be able to publish, pull messages. So it's fully compatible with the X-Road network as is. And one thing here to note is that why we didn't consider it as an add-on to the security server is also, one of the reasons is also the fact that GovStack specifies its own API for how the messaging part of the system works. We needed to control this API, and we decided that having this messaging component would do a better job than a security server, than adding stuff to the security server. And if I go back a bit on the slides now, so we come to this slide. So as we see, service access was partially solved by X-Road as is. We just needed to add more fine-grained access control in terms of how the rooms and messaging works. PubSub service, while not addressed with X-Road, since we added it as a subsystem, it's fully compatible with any new and old X-Road implementation. Because to be frank, I don't see X-Road as a concept getting rid of subsystem concept. There will be services. So since it's just a service, it will be compatible with future iterations of X-Road. But since we unified it in a way in terms of using a unified access control method in the form of Keycloak or any other OAuth 2 provider, it is more heavily or more tightly coupled with the security server than your average subsystem. The security server will pull its authorization data from the same source. And theoretically, we would envision in the future for this system to be kind of applicable or convertible to an add-on. And we even, for the management UI part, we even reused a lot of X-Road's UI components. The UI itself is actually written in Vue.js, the same as X-Road's management UI. So those systems could be integrated together. So again, we see it as the PubSub part as the next iteration for X-Road as well. But for now, Information Mediator uses X-Road as its core technology, building the PubSub system and its specific APIs on top of it, with a future prospect of one or both initiatives having more collaboration or integrating with each other more. But with that, and with about 30 seconds to go, I conclude this presentation. Feel free to reach out to me, Allan Bernard at nortal.com or Nortal. Feel free to check out more about GovStack. It's an open source public initiative, and they will be very welcoming of both your interest and your help if you choose to offer it. And yeah, feel free to check out Niisi's take and Petteri take. I highly recommend it on adding PubSub to X-Road as is. And I thank you so much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to present. And that's it from me. Thank you.
But that was very great, Allan, I must say. And I'm going to feel very free now to ask questions that we have received from our audience. You know, I got to tell you that this was the most popular presentation right now, because we have received like tons of different questions from our audience. So I'm just going to kick it off here. I'm going to ask you the questions here. So let's take the first one that is has the most votes here. Is the GovStack BobSub implementation for X-Road available as open source? If yes, where can I find it?
So we still have one milestone to deliver, so we're still hard at work. I just wanted to take this opportunity to address the community before we actually publish it. But yes, GovStack, everything GovStack does is open source, and when it's announced that the solution building block is available, it absolutely will be public source, the code and the configuration.
All right, a very concrete answer. How many X-Road ecosystems can we foresee to be added in the coming years through GovStack?
It's hard to tell from my perspective. It really depends. So GovStack kind of solves a different problem than X-Road. It takes a wider approach to digitalization, and especially like public services digitalization. So I would rather say that it's a question of how many new governments or governments employ those practices and standards.
Okay. Speaking of which countries are most likely to adopt GovStack solutions?
I would hate to speak on behalf of GovStack and its teams who are doing an amazing job of promoting this. But I think there are some very promising and emerging governments in Africa that are looking towards like taking the next step in evolution immediately. Like starting off with digitalization at its bleeding edge.
All right, we have more and more questions coming. So how far and how are you working on security servers? The source is the same, but what models are added? And will it be released following the future X-Road update? So
we are working together with NIS. In many things, Nortal is actually engaged with NIS on working on the core X-Road project itself. Currently, there are not any concrete plans in implementing the changes we have done to the X-Road code. The fork we have made for X-Road will absolutely be made publicly available. And the only change, as I said, is just adding the option of the security server authenticating via OAuth 2. I'm very hesitant, we're very hesitant in modifying or adding to the security server code.
All right, let's take another one. So is the GovStack aiming for government digital stack to be adopted as a whole, or a stack from which specific solutions, such as information mediator, building blocks, can be selected?
It absolutely follows the best practices for architecture building blocks. So you can pick and choose any component, and as I said, it's a set of specification. It is a standard in a way, but a standard is a guideline, not a straitjacket. So absolutely you can just employ one building block, and absolutely you can modify it. You can provide any solution you would like, depending on your specific solution. So the answer is a resounding yes.
All right, you're so fast for replying to this as well. So what were the specific technical challenges you faced while working with the X-Road infrastructure for the information mediator?
Technical, I think the deployment, especially deployment of the central server, is something that we spent a lot of time and effort on getting that right. So information mediator building block, as said, it needs to deploy as kind of one thing. It needs to be a turnkey solution. You just hit a button and it deploys. Anyone familiar, and I think the number of people are not too large who are familiar with deploying the central server and the whole ecosystem, it's currently a bit more complicated than just running some Docker containers. So the biggest challenge was enabling that system to deploy it to be deployed and configured seamlessly. And that code as well, the CI/CD code, will be made available as well by GovStack, but it's at their discretion, of course.
I promise that's the last one now, then I'll
That's
let you go here. Given the fast evolving nature of tech, how does GovStack plan to keep its adaptations of X-Road current and forward compatible? Okay, so the adaptations are small, as I said, and we are hoping to integrate actually those adaptations to further X-Road deployments, so at one point we wouldn't need to be kind of parallel to the X-Road core development. We could just say that it's the X-Road core development that gets core packages that get deployed. All right, thank you very, very much, Allan.